Okay, Howard, we ready? Great. Well, we're actually going to start on time. All right, in that case, good evening all. Today, as you know, we're going to have this, let me put it this way. It's the 3 weeks. I always look at something, look for a sad topic, or better yet, a solemn or serious topic, as befits the 3 weeks. And I've gone through most of the famous tragic episodes in Jewish history. But now we have to think a little bit larger. And that's where assimilation came to me, even though as you're going to see over here, I'm not going to use the word assimilation in the typical way that most people do, which is not exactly accurate. I mean, I talk like that, you talk like it, but that's not actually what it means. So this is a 6-part series, the Jews in Assimilation. And I want to start, as always, by thanking the Shul Ner Tamid for hosting us. It's very kind of them, Rabbi Motzen and all concerned. It's very good of them. This is also the home ground of Bill Saxon, therefore the tech team. So therefore, if anything, I hope nothing goes wrong, but he should know what it is if it's on their Talmud ground. That's there. But thank you very much for our tech team, who everybody really owes a round of applause to, because they make it possible, for this to happen. You need two things. You need me, you need them. I want to start tonight by thanking our sponsors tonight, Steve Kaplan, who's doing it in honor of the Chayalim in Israel. I know they have relatives there, and I bet you everybody here has relatives also. And the war's not over, right? The war's not over, and the casualties, unfortunately, are not over, as we all know. This series is going to be, I plan to do 6 of them, as you can see on the chart. So it's Monday, Wednesday, Monday, Wednesday. Thanks to Shmuel Tarshish, I see him here somewhere. So we've been able to get 4 sponsors so far. So I need another 2 if anybody will step forward and make life easier for all concerned. We'd appreciate it. And I think, without any further ado, we'll start the first lecture, which, as you can see, is entitled The Challenge of Hellenism. What's the other one? And Ancient Judaism. Okay, so let me begin. Assimilation today is a pejorative, at least in our circles. Okay? It's a pejorative. It means you're losing your Judaism, losing one's Jewish identity even. You say, oh, they're all assimilated. That's how we use the term, in popular speech. But that's just in contemporary slang. In reality, assimilation has been a basic feature of Jewish history since the beginning, if you think about it intelligently. Wherever Jews have lived, especially in Chutz La'aretz, they've picked up stuff from the surrounding cultures. That's just a fact of history. The Satmar Rebbe did not speak ancient Hebrew, right? He spoke a dialect of German. Okay, where'd they get that from? Now, the pertinent question, therefore, is, what has been the relation of Jews to assimilation? Okay, so you understand what I'm saying? It's a fact. Abraham was assimilated. There's no such thing as not being. The question is, what is it that you choose to assimilate? How have Jews coped with the pressures of living not by themselves in a desert island, but in the midst of sea of humanity who are not Jewish? Because it's never been possible in Jewish history to live only with Jews. B'nai Brak never existed until 1948. So now, as a result of the state of Israel, you can have a yeshiva at Disneyland. Well, if you live in B'nai Brak, there are no people that are not like you. That never existed. Let me put it this way. The Mir Yeshiva, Ger Hasidim, Satmar, you name it. Most of the people lived there were not Jewish. Most of the people, I don't care how Hasidic you are, how ultra-Orthodox you are. Most of the people you saw on the street were not like you. Okay? Today it's kind of funny. In this neighborhood, where my children have grown up, I've been here since I got married, and there are churches. Not really. And since you probably don't think about it. I grew up in Forest Park, which is considered a pretty doggone Jewish neighborhood. 1,000 churches. I don't say I noticed them all, but if you ever drive back in there, you say, oh yeah, this one here, and that. What about the 3 or 4 shuls? That's a way of looking at things. You walk on the street in Manhattan, and you see 4 Hasidim, you say, this place is full of Jews, right? You don't notice the 10,000 other people of 100 different groups. That's a way of looking at things. But in terms of objective reality, wherever Jews were, they usually were surrounded by people who were not. In this series, we're going to try to look and how Jewish communities were successful in coping or not. How they managed to absorb parts of the surrounding cultures without disappearing into those cultures and becoming Bata Bashishim Lach Balach, which means if you have a little bit of milk and it falls in a big vat of chicken soup, halachically and chemically, it really dissolves into nothing, to negligibility. There have been cases of assimilation, and there are currently, where Jews dissolve into the surrounding environment to the point of negligibility. That is true. I'm not talking about that so much. Rather, I'm speaking about those who you drop a little milk in a big vat of chicken soup, and the milk retains its identity. You see? I don't say it's not affected by the vast amount of chicken soup in which the milk is located, but you still see that white little thing running around. That's been the Jewish experience, which is very unusual. Now, we will look at failed communities who disappeared into the surrounding culture. That's a fact. You know and I know, if you go by DNA, there are a lot of places in Europe and the Middle East, back, they're Jewish, right? Including sometimes, for all I know, for all you know, I mean, I don't know this, Sinwar might have been Jewish. You know what I'm saying, right? If you go back. Who knows? So that's Bata B'Shishim, okay? Lach Balach. The funny thing is that the Frum have created a myth, which is that we don't change, right? You all know that one, correct? Now, but no organism in nature can survive without adaptation. You know what I just said? No organism in nature can survive without adaptation. The trick is to change the non-essential while preserving the essential. Of course, the bigger trick is how do you define what's non-essential and what's essential, right? To a Satmar Chassi sees somebody walking with a kippah sruga, you've abandoned the essential, you see? The person with the kippah sruga says, I guess, see somebody without a yam, but you've abandoned the essential. The person that, sees another Jew who doesn't like a bagel with a cream cheese, you've abandoned the essential. Everybody gets to, determine what they consider. These issues, if you think about it, go back to the dawn of Jewish history. At a dumb level, Abraham dressed like a Mesopotamian. Did Abraham Avinu dress like this? Okay. Before I proceed, now by the way, that does bother the Hasidim. I remember years ago, and maybe some of you have seen this, a long time ago I was once in Williamsburg in New York, and must have been before, when I was dating, I think, long ago. And maybe, I don't remember, but the thing is, I brought home a coloring book, Purim. Purim. For kids, coloring book. But Mordechai and Esther are dressed like Satmar. Well, because, wait a minute, what do you want the kids doing the drawing to say? How come they're not dressed like us? You mean it wasn't always this way? You understand? Now, before I proceed, I will observe in general terms that what the Jews down the centuries ended up doing consisted, in my opinion, of two tactics, right? Number one, selective appropriation. Selective appropriation. I got a tie on, right? On the other hand, I'm not wearing a cross. You're wearing American shoes. I'm talking English. On the other hand, I'm not, going on a Hajj. You see? Now, I would say that's a way of selective appropriation. And that's something the Jews will always do, or not survive. And the other thing is reconstitution in Judaic form. You take something that's not Jewish, and you absorb it, and you reconstitute it, and then become something specifically Jewish. So, in contemporary Baltimore, you see somebody wearing a black hat and a white shirt and a black pair of pants and a black tie. Everybody knows that's an Orthodox Jew. Hold on for a second. A black hat is Western wear, and so is a jacket, and so is a white shirt, and so is a tie, and so forth. You understand? But you took elements of the other thing and you reconstituted in Judaism. It's a very specifically Judaic form. When you see the Hasidim, everybody knows that was the style in Europe many centuries ago. Not anymore. Very quickly it became Jewish, Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox. So you reconstitute in Judaic form. Now, the key term here is Judaic, not Jewish. Judaic means religious. You reconstitute in religious form. Bagels and cream cheese don't quite cut it. That's Jewish and not Judaic. Okay? Now, I'm sure some people will say, how can you say that, Rabbi Katz? A bagel, that's more important than the Ten Commandments, right? For some people. I get it. But that's Jewish. It's not Judaic. The modern pejorative assimilation refers to appropriation of counter-Judaic beliefs and practices. In other words, if I say today somebody's assimilated, it means they picked up counter-Judaic stuff. You understand? And that calls for some thinking, right? That calls for an intelligent evaluation of who you have in front of you or what you have in front of you. Now, counter-Judaic assimilation goes back to ancient times, at least according to Chazal, in ancient Egypt, before the Exodus. That's what the Jews did, according to the rabbis, right after the death of Joseph. It's the Medrash Rabbah, where it says, Vayakam el Chadosh al Mitzrayim, and we all know what that means, a new king arose. And the Medrash Rabbah starts by quoting a pasuk, Vashem Bagdu Kibonim Zor Yiloto Achilm Kodesh. And what does it mean? Rabbanim Piskal Haikra, oh my goodness, didn't present right. We'll go to the third line. That the rabbis say this applies to the generation after Joseph. And when Joseph died, and he was the viceroy of Egypt, his children or grandchildren, whoever it was around that time, ceased circumcision. They stopped it. Amru, Nia Kamitzrim. We want to be like the Egyptians. So in other words, they're assimilating on a fundamental, on a counter-Judaic practice. And we know this because later on Moshe had to give everybody a bris before they left Egypt. The Kivin also came, and what happened as a result of this, once the Jews abandoned circumcision, so God arranged it that the positive feelings that the Egyptians had entertained towards them until that point shifted to negative feelings. The positive feelings of Abba shifted to sinner, because after all, when Joseph was around, they liked the Jews. They're helping their country seriously. But now, all of a sudden, not. So this is a very interesting medrash, and it is asserting that assimilation and serious assimilation is like ancient. It's before the Yetzias Mitzrayim. As a matter of fact, it is the cause, according to this medrash, of the enslavement in Egypt. Vayokam Melech Chodesh Mitzrayim means that the king may have been new or may have not been new, but he was faced with a new situation. And he's responding to this business. What is this thing that the Jews are trying to look like us, and they're not us? You see, next thing you want to know, they're going to try to take over the country and claim to be Egyptians, etc., etc. And they're not us. That's one version that comes down in rabbinic literature. But since the Jewish religion is very disorganized, we always have a lot of different competing narratives. A different narrative that we've all heard of says, Loshino Shmam, Loshinus Lashonam, that even when the Jews were in Egypt, they didn't change their names and they didn't change their language. That's another version. There are Chazals that agree with that, there are Chazals that don't agree with that. It's a little bit hard to hear that circumcision they would give up, but they still call themselves freedmen. A little strange, you understand? Now, on the third hand, the first word of the Ten Commandments is in Egyptian language. And Chazal say, we all heard this, that's because the Jews didn't know Hebrew. So what happened to Loshinu as Lashono? So you see, there are narratives and counter-narratives when you get involved in the rabbinic descriptions of history. Not for the first time, the Talmudic rabbis will have trouble accepting that there was assimilation. Right? The Rambam, when he discusses his understanding of, how shall I put it, the rise of monotheism, idolatry and the rise of monotheism, which goes with Abraham, he has a whole version of history in which, according to him, the Jews totally assimilated, I repeat, totally assimilated when they were in Egypt. If you can look at that, I won't read the whole thing, but I'll tell you, if you go to like a little bit halfway down, and it says, V'nasa ba'olam uma shlema sheyadas Hashem, that after Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, there was such a large group of converts to monotheism that there was an entire nation that was monotheistic. Ad she'archu hayamim liyisrael b'Mitzrayim, until the Jews ended up spending some time in Egypt. V'chazru l'ilmod ma'aseyim v'la'ovid kochavim kamosam. And the Jews picked up all the Egyptian habits and worshipped the Egyptian religion. Okay? So in other words, the whole Abraham project fell apart. They all worshipped the Egyptian religion, so that's real assimilation. Okay? Chutz mi shevet Levi sham b'mitzvah zabos me'olam ol b'shevi avodas kochavim. Except for the tribe of Levi that stood firm. Now that's a version of history. There are Chazals that say that Levi was like this, and there are other Chazals that say that Levi was like that. Okay? Ukimat kot ha'ikar sheshas olam Avinu nekar, and things were almost at the point that the principle of monotheism that Abraham had implanted was in danger of going extinct. V'chozu b'nei Yaakov l'tos ha'olam tiyusam, and the children of Yaakov, meaning the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, all those who were in Egypt, were about to go totally paganistic without any chance of redemption. But because God liked the Jewish people and liked Abraham, also Moshe Rabbeinu, Rabban Kol Nevi'im, God created this guy called Moses, who had it in him to lead them away from that. Okay? And then when Moshe came along, he taught him about idolatry and all the rest of it. That's a version of history which says the Jewish people totally assimilated. And it took divine intervention, almost a kind of miraculous business. They picked some guy named Moses who also was assimilated. He was the prince of Egypt, right? And then God so organized his life in funny ways that he ends up running away and being a minion, etc., and burning bush, etc., etc., etc. So basically what this is saying is, you don't have a chance against total, complete assimilation without divine intervention. That's what seems over here, okay? It's not very flattering to the Jewish people. And as we know, right, let's go to the next one, right? As the story in the Chumash, the Pentateuch reveals, it's easier to take them out of Egypt, take Egypt out of them. Because what's the first thing the Jews do when they get a chance? When the teacher goes out of the room, when Moshe goes up the mountain, they make a golden calf. In other words, this is what we're used to for the last 100 or 200 years. Okay? So, this is not the same thing. I was once in Ocean City. It was the year I was saying Kaddish for my mom, back in 2008. And I stayed in Boulder the whole time, but one time, Thanksgiving and all that, Karen wanted the whole family should be for a thing in Ocean City. But what am I going to do for a minion? So the long and the short of it, she called up the sensations over there, and she says, "Can you help us get a minion?" Because my husband say Kaddish. And the guy said, "You tell me how many people you'll bring in, and I'll supply the others." Because it was winter, it's Thanksgiving time, and nobody's in Ocean City. Okay, and he did. We had like 3 or 4, and they gave us 6 or something like that. And we made a minion, which was very kind of them. I'm very appreciative. But they were all Sephardic, because they're all Moroccan sensations, they're all also Sephardic Jews. And it's a Lubavitch place. It's right outside before you get to Ocean City. And, okay, since it's a Lubavitch place, naturally, it's a big picture of the Rebbe in the front, and they got the Lubavitch sitters and the whole 9 yards. But when the cats are away, they might as well play. Since it was the winter time, so all the regulars are gone, including the local rabbi. He hit the scene for somewhere else. So it's only these Sephardic guys over there. So down goes a picture of the Lubavitch Rebbe, up goes a picture of Avad Yosef, down goes all the Nusach Hari sitters, up come out all the Sephardic sitters and all the rest, because that's their natural thing you go back to. Well, that's the Jewish people with the golden calf. They only left a few weeks before Egypt, right? And that's what they're used to. Probably people had golden calves or silver calves or stuff like that anytime. And so it's easier to take them out of Egypt than to take Egypt out of them. And this is in the Chumash. This is not me making a cynical comment. This is the Bible. Okay? And what happens when we get to, after that, to the time of Joshua? What does it say? Joshua ben Nun served the Lord, etc. After that, verse 10, the whole generation, I was able to read it, generation gathered ancestors, another generation grew up. This is the first generation in Israel, who neither knew the Lord nor had done for Israel. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the God of their ancestors that brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped gods of people around them. They aroused God's anger because they forsook him and served the Baal and Asherah. In his anger against Israel, God gave them the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold in the hands of enemies all around. They were no longer able to do so. When Israel went out to fight, Handler was against them to defeat them just as they were, and they were in great distress. Is that it we have? And then the Lord raised up judges. The point I wanted to show you was verse... they didn't listen to the judges. There's a lot of intermarriage. That's what this is over there. Okay? It's one of these particular over here. Now, and by the way, it's talking about the inhabitants of Israel. Right? I won't drive them out, and I'll test Israel as they did. So once again, the first thing the Jews do when they have a chance is go back to assimilate. Not to Egypt, because that's over. So to the local non-Jewish population, who they were supposed to get rid of. Now I repeat, this is in the Tanakh. These are psukim in the Torah. And then, without getting into too many details, we know that later on they set up a kingdom, and then they come under the cultural influence, I repeat, the religious and cultural influence of the Assyrian Empire of Ashur. And so we're told there was a king named Achaz, who was the king of Judah, right? And what does it say? Achaz went to Damascus to meet the king of Assyria. He saw an altar in Damascus, and he sent to Uriah, the high priest, a sketch of the altar with detailed plans for its construction. So Uriah the priest built an altar in accordance with the plans the king Achaz had set from Damascus and finished it before King Achaz returned. So in other words, the Jews had a base of Mikdash at this time. This is the time of the kingdom of Judah. And they had the Jewish furniture. The altars, the stands, the Kodesh Kodashim, whatever they had from Shlomo Melech's time. This guy comes, and he's enamored, Achaz was wicked, with the Assyrians because they conquered the Middle East, so they must be the top dogs. And he said, I guess, I'm going to get rid of my altar, move that away, he says to the high priest, and put in the Assyrian altar. That looks more cool, okay? And it says, King Achaz returned, and when the king came back from Damascus, saw the altar, he approached it and presented offerings. Only offers burnt offering, grain offering, drink offering, splashed the blood against the altar. As for the bronze altar that stood before the Lord, meaning instead of the kosher altar, so to speak, he brought it in front of the temple, and he put it on the north side of the new altar. Like, as if to say like this, they took the mechitza out and put it behind the organ, like that. These are instances of assimilation. You get the picture during the biblical era, because this is not the only time. I'm just not going to spend the whole night on this. And then the Jews go into the first exile. I'm not talking about the 10 tribes. The 10 tribes assimilate to the point of Bittul. In other words, where are the 10 tribes? The answer is they ain't around. Now I know we've heard rumors from time to time, et cetera, that they're here, there, and elsewhere. And people believe that and so forth. First of all, by the way, it's a machlokas in the Mishnah, whether the 10 tribes are coming back or not. So already in the time of the Mishnah, it's Rabbi Kiva versus Rabbi Lezer in Sanhedrin. One says, the Aser says, Shawat Masid Lachzer, the other one says not. The one who says not, is get over it. That's pretty weird. 10 out of 12 tribes of Klal Yisrael, the shiftei kah, the things we put all the time and all the rest of it, write it off. Right? Write it off. Now today, and from time to time in Jewish history, the rabbis have sent emissaries looking for them and all the rest of it. Now, you never know. To be perfectly honest, you never know. But we know the whole earth today and they ain't there. So the only possible way that appears to me, living in dumb 2025, is maybe DNA will discover something. Yeah, I don't know. You get what I'm saying? That could be the frontier. Maybe. But I know one thing. For the last 3,000 years, 2,500 years, 2,700 years, they've assimilated to the point of losing their identity. So if it turns out the Pakistanis are really the 10 lost tribes. They don't know that. They'll have to be reacquainted with their identity the way someone, like you read these movies or novels, someone who thinks that these are his parents and discovers 50 years later, no, those are your parents. That must, knock you for a loop. So it's going to have to be something like that. But absent that, what happened to 10 of the 12 tribes? They assimilated to the point of nothingness. In other words, the Pashup shot is, there was an empire of Ashur, of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was not that big. It's more or less what you'd say today, Iraq, Syria, and Israel, Jordan, that area. And for a little bit of time, Egypt. So the area of Iraq and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, it's not as big as U.S. So where did they take these Jews and dump them? They couldn't put them in Alaska. Where'd they put them? Somewhere, in Syria, what you and I today call Syria, Iraq, Turkey, something like that. So where are they? They assimilated to the point, lach balach, of negligibility. Okay? And then the Jews go into the Babylonian, but this is the empire of Nebuchadnezzar at its peak. Okay? It's actually a little smaller than that. But anyway, it includes Israel. And you and I know that, this is the 3 weeks now, right? Yesterday, Shiva B'Tammuz is when Nebuchadnezzar's army captured Jerusalem, broke the walls down. They burned everything on Tisha B'Av, but they captured the city yesterday. Now, what's that all about? Well, the Jews get exiled, whoever survives, to Babylonia. So the Jews are picked up whole, few that were there, and marched off on a death march from Jerusalem to Baghdad. That's roughly where Babylonia was, roughly. And whoever survived, survived. And now Klal Yisrael finds itself in Gullus. Are they speaking Hebrew? Are they living in Tel Aviv or Yerushalayim? They're in a completely alien environment now. For the first time, the Jews as a people are strangers in a strange land. You and I know this is a phenomenon that will become a permanent feature of Jewish history. From now on, Jewish history will feature two phenomena. The Jews in the exile, right? And the Jews in Chutz La'aretz, and in Eretz Yisrael, right? Or let me put it this way. To be more exact, we'll have two phenomena, exile and diaspora. Exile means all the Jews are in Chutz La'aretz. Diaspora means some Jews are in Israel and the other Jews are in Chutz La'aretz. There have been times where there are no Jews, or practically no Jews in Israel, right? And we know that. It's a sad business. A lot of the time, it's been a combo. Only today, you and I live in a time, we have merited to live in a time where in the state of Israel is the largest Jewish community in the world. It's not 51% of the Jewish people yet, but it's getting there. Mainly because the Jews in the diaspora don't have any kids. And assimilation and intermarriage, all the rest of it. It's out there, it's shrinking. But there are about 7.5 million Jews in Israel today, Ken Yerbo, and that's more than America, right? I don't care how you count your numbers. So that's unusual. But usually, throughout history, there have been Jews in both places, in Israel and in Chutz La'aretz. Now, the diaspora also varies, as I said. 51% of Jews in Israel, 51% of the Jews are not. And today, for the first time in thousands of years, we're close to the point where 51% of the Jews are in Israel, close to it, if current trends continue. But already back in Babylonia, we find the pattern of the specific form of Jewish assimilation. How so? Nebuchadnezzar does not force the Jews to drop their religion. That's interesting. Wherever the Jews are going to find themselves in history, they may be persecuted, they may be punished in some way. They're not forced to change their religion. When that happens, usually they're kicked out or something like that. You understand? Like in Spain. Gullus means the Jews are in somebody else's land, but they're still allowed to practice the Jewish religion. I don't know why Nebuchadnezzar didn't simply say, drop your religion and pick up mine, but he did. Since they can retain their religion, they can appropriate aspects of the surrounding culture without disintegrating. And that's what happens. Because who are the first Jewish characters we know about in Babylonia? Daniel and his three buddies. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're in the first chapter of the book of Daniel. And what's the thing they do? They go to Harvard. Right? They go to Harvard. If you remember the story, Nebuchadnezzar said to pick from the Jewish captives the best looking and smartest kids and then send them to his special school, elite school, so that they'll be able to get good jobs in the bureaucracy, because everybody knows if you want to run a country or a company, you need talent. You do whatever it takes to do talent. So brainwash these kids to be Babylonian culture. It says they taught them the reading and the writing of the Chaldean language and whatever were the elite subjects at that time. I remember dream interpretation was big on the agenda, but also math and science and all that according to the style of that time. And so the bottom line is like this. Daniel is a from Jew. That's why we have a book in Tanakh named after him. But he had an excellent secular education. They have non-Jewish names. Because we're told Daniel's name is Belshazzar, and the other three are given the name Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they're assimilating. But how much do they lose their identity, right? They speak Babylonian. They may have married non-Jews. There is a Tosfos that talks about the fact in Mar Megillah that Daniel married a Persian princess at one point, and she wouldn't speak his language, and that's why he maneuvered the king to issue that Achashverosh decree. But you see, Tosfos doesn't have a recoil from saying that Daniel was married to a Persian princess. So they circulate, as we would say today, in non-Jewish society, in the upper levels. At the same time, they're religious Jews. The three friends of Daniel were thrown into the furnace rather than bow down to the idol. Remember that? Right? And Daniel wouldn't stop davening 3 times a day, even though it meant he was eventually thrown into the lion's den. So what do you do with this? The guy dresses Brooks Brothers, and he has, like I said before, he really has a Harvard pin, and he's on first name terms with Obama and everybody. He really is, right? At the same time, he's at the point where his Judaism is so strong that he gets some kind of Ruach HaKodesh. What is that? You see? What's the greatest effect of Babylonian assimilation? This is sad. When the Jews are able to go back to Israel in the time of the Persians, most of them don't go. And you can't exactly say the climate in Iraq is so fantastic, right? Hits 150 degrees there too. But they got liked it enough that after the decree of Cyrus lets them go back, they don't go back. Very few do, as you know, okay? Indeed, the Jews in Bavel will not leave Bavel until the Mongols come and kill them in the 1200 CE. When the Mongols come and kill everybody in Iraq. Genghis Khan, okay? So, you hear what I just said? Let's say the base of Mikdash was destroyed around, usually say 586 BC or something like that. 500 BCE. The Jews stayed there for 1700 years. From the 500s BCE to the 1200s CE. That's a long time. And what's so great about Bavel? You get used to it. I've heard that people get used to living in a place called Baltimore, Maryland. Such a things happen. You understand? And again, you can't say because it has fantastic climate. If you told me they live in San Diego, no, I get it. You understand? So what's going on over here? And the ones who do come back, by the way, Zerubbabel and those guys, bring Geisha stuff back with them into the heart of Judaism itself. So these are the good ones who make Aliyah. But what do you find with the Jews who come back and make Aliyah? And I repeat over and over again, these are stories in the Tanakh. This is not some, secular writer bringing up negative information about the family. This is the Torah, right? What do they bring back? First of all, Shemus Chadashim Alami Bavel, which is interesting. The months we have are Babylonian names, not Jewish names. Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Teves. I think you kind of know these are not even Jewish-sounding names, right? In fact, to be perfectly honest, if the Babylonian language, the ancient Babylonian language, exists and survives anywhere, it's probably in Rosh Chodesh, right? Like, let me put it this way. Where in the world today, I don't know the answer to this, but I doubt, where in the world today do you ever hear the word Cheshvan, Kislev? Except in a shul. It's kind of funny. What else? Ksav Ivri, Ksav Ashuri, our script. Ksav Ashuri means the Ksav, the script, that comes from Ashur or Babylon. So there are different opinions about this. The article has a whole essay, but the plain meaning, and according to some, already in the Gemara, it's a discussion, the Jews dropped the old Hebrew and picked up the new Hebrew, right? So in other words, the Hebrew you recognize is from Ashur or from Babel. What? A Sefer Torah is written in the wrong script? These are signs of assimilation, or to be more exact, selective appropriation, and then reconstitution in Judaic form. You see? And what's the big crisis from the time of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah? Intermarriage. Doesn't Ezra have to come back and tell everybody, get rid of your Goyish wives, including the sons of the Kohen Gadol? Including all the big shots? And later when Nehemiah comes up to help him, he's got to fight against all the local Arab chieftains who have their Jewish son-in-laws, who are betraying the Jews to their father-in-laws, Sanballat and these other guys. Now what is that? So that's what I mean when I say that assimilation is, a challenge that Jews have faced literally from day one. Okay? And by the way, these are the religious ones. These are the ones that made Aliyah. The others are sitting back in Babel. Okay? Intermarriage, as you know, will play a big role throughout the centuries in the context of Jewish assimilation. Now, we don't really know how Judaism itself was practiced in Babylonia. Notice during the 70 years and afterwards, let's say the 70 years in between Bayis Rishon and Bayis Sheni, 80 years, whatever it was. What does it mean to practice Judaism? You're not living in Eretz Yisrael anymore. There's no Truma and Meiser, and there's no Beis HaMikdash, and no Karbonis. And davening didn't exist in a formal sense at that time. At least that's what the Rambam tells us. You see? How'd they do it? Did they have shuls? If you think about it, look, I wasn't there, so you never know. That it's got to be that the Jews began to develop some idea of synagogues or something like that, some substitute when they're in Babel. How do you stay even Jewish? What does that mean? How do you practice it? Can't simply be you have a theological, philosophical idea there's one God. There's got to be some way of doing it. What was Shabbos in ancient Babylon? Right? When the Jews were there. Okay? Now, despite the Rambam, probably the davening, the Shemona Esrei, synagogues, brachas, in some form, evolved in the Golish Bavel. Now, the Rambam has a whole theory that it started with Anshe Knesset Gdola, which means among the Jews who returned to Israel and were having trouble because of intermarriage. This is what Rambam says. Because of intermarriage and their own kids, he says, there's a pasuk like that, couldn't finish a sentence in any language. If you're old enough in Baltimore, you remember all the all the refugees, they couldn't say a sentence in one language. Geg nem epis from my car. Get kaifin in the store. Things like that. Half English, they couldn't finish it either. And the Rambam suggests that this made people inarticulate and afraid to express themselves, and therefore they weren't davening at all, and therefore they created this template, to help those. To my understanding, nobody knows where the Rambam gets this from, and it's more likely, I'm just guessing, I don't know, this already started in Babel. They had to have some kind of Jewish something or other. You see, they had to have some kind of Yiddishkeit. In other words, these were responses to the challenges of assimilation, leading to the disappearance of Judaism and Jewish identity if you don't come up with something. And therefore, they had to create, if I'm right, the creation of the synagogue is an example of a constructive response to Judaism. You're creating a Jewish institution that never existed, which is very powerful, very influential, and allows you, enables you to survive without losing your Jewish identity, religious or otherwise, religious or ethnic, because you have a little island called the synagogue. You see? Now, and you have specifically Jewish prayers. And you make sure that they're in a language called Hebrew, or you try to anyway, and you preserve some kind of a Jewish identity, otherwise you lose it. That's my point. Assimilation can be confronted constructively or not, right? Or not. So if you're coming with something Jewish, what is your response? Nehemiah, who comes right after Ezra and is the Persian appointed governor, he sure as heck was assimilated. he was the cupbearer to the king of Persia. So Israel just bombed Iran. At that time, the king of Iran, the Shah, the emperor, the Shah, his prime minister, cupbearer means like this, he gives you the wine to drink. That's a golden opportunity to do what? Poison. So if I trust you, means I trust you. And he trusts a Shomer Shabbos Jew named Nehemiah, who therefore obviously knows all the Persian stuff. As we would say today, he was dressed in Persian Brooks Brothers, whatever it is, Iranian high fashion of that time, and knows the culture and language, and I'm sure he knew the religion. And the king likes him, otherwise he wouldn't give him that position of trust. And who's Nehemiah? When he hears that Yerushalayim is in trouble, he asks the king, give me a leave of absence so I can go and fix the situation in Yerushalayim. And the king ought to say like this, you don't like the job here? Hit the road. And what does the king of Persia say to him? How long will you be gone? Which is the ultimate compliment. Okay? So what do? It's an assimilated Jew, but he's retained, or somehow or other constructed. I wasn't there. Somehow or other, there's inside of him, you understand? And I'm going to help my people. And it doesn't hurt Persia at all. It's not like a dual loyalty he's going against his employers. Nothing he did was against Persia, but it was to help the Jews. Okay? And not for the last time, you'll see this phenomenon. Now we move from what we call the period of biblical Judaism to ancient Judaism. In the history profession, when you say ancient Judaism, you mean the Judaism of the Greek and Roman times. You just learned something. It doesn't mean, ordinarily you think it's from the Tanakh period, but remember the historians don't believe there was Judaism in the biblical period. So, but when you get to the Greco-Roman era after Alexander the Great, we know there's a lot of Jews there, and the Romans and the others are talking about it all the time. We have records, as we say, especially Gaisha records, Greek and Roman historians and writers, though you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. One of the most famous Roman historians is Tacitus, right? When I was a kid, you had to learn that stuff. And the Annals of Tacitus. Who writes it? He was a Roman senator, all the rest of it. He's got a passage on the Jews. Let's see if it matches anything you know about Judaism, right? Some say, who are Tacitus like is, who are these people anyway? Who are the Jews? Well, some say that the Jews were fugitives from the island of Crete, who settled on the nearby coast of Africa when Saturn was driven from throne by the power of Jupiter. So we're Cretans, with an A, right? By the way, I know where that comes from. The Philistines come from Crete. So the Palestinians, Plishtim Yotzim Kaftor, we're told. They really historically do. So there was some kind of connection, but it's like the game of telephone, And I can just see, he's a Roman senator, so there's some kind of party, and they're all drinking this now. They say, who are these Jews anyway, And, what's his name? Tucker Carlson says this, and this one says this, and Tacitus says that. Evidence of this sought in the name. There's a famous island, a mountain in Crete called Ida, and the neighboring tribe, the Idai, country called Uday, by barbarous lengthening of that last name. That's one theory. Others assert that in the reign of Isis in Egypt, in other words, the overflowing population of Egypt, led by Rusulamus, as Jerusalem and Judas, discharged themselves in the neighboring countries. Well, that's a little bit true. What do I mean by that? The Jews started out in Egypt and got out and went to other countries. It's the game of telephone, okay? Many, again, say that they were a race of Ethiopian origin, who in the time of King Cepheus was driven by fear and hatred of their neighbors to seek a new dwelling place. That's interesting. Moses had an Ethiopian wife. Again, you see how telephone works? Others describe them as an Assyrian horde. Now that's a little bit true, because we come from Abraham, who comes from, not Assyria, but right next door. Ur Kasdim is, southern Iraq. So, who not having sufficient territory, took possession of a part of Egypt and founded cities on their own in what's called the Hebrew country, lying on the borders of Syria. That's already what we call Goshen. They heard about the Jews lived in Goshen. Others assign a very distinguished origin to the Jews, alleging that they were the Sulamai, a nation celebrated in the poems of Homer, who called the city Rissalomia, Jerusalem, after their name. Most writers agree, however, in stating that once upon a time a disease which horribly disfigured the body broke out over Egypt. The king at that time of Egypt, Bacchus, seeking a remedy, consulted the oracle of Hammon. He went to the Egyptian gods and was told to cleanse his realm and to convey into some foreign land this race detested by the gods. The people who've been collected, after a diligent search, finding themselves left in the desert, sat for a time in stupor of grief, till one of the exiles, called Moses, warned them not to look for any relief from God or man, forsaken as they were of both, but to trust themselves to him, taking for their heaven-sent leader that man who should first help them be quit of their present misery. In other words, where do you find water? They agreed, and in utter ignorance they began to advance at random. Nothing distressed them as much as the lack of water, and they had already sunk ready to perish in the plains, when a herd of wild donkeys was seen to retire from a pasture to a rock shaded by trees, so it was an oasis. Moses followed them, and guided by the appearance of a grassy spot, discovered an abundant spring of water. This furnished relief. After a continuous journey of 6 days, on the 7th, they possessed themselves of a country, by which they expelled the inhabitants, in 1 day, mind you, and found them sitting in the temple. Do you see where it comes from? Do you see? They made a chant. Every little detail of it here has some kind of foundation, just not the way they put it. They were wandering in the desert. They didn't find anything. Moshe found them water. They were there. Now the only thing is like this: you didn't leave Egypt. You were kicked out. Okay, and everybody knows the Hebrews are a health menace. They were kicked out for spreading the plague. You see? Now Moses. By the way, and this is a Harvard-educated historian, as we would say today. Tacitus is a Roman senator who's supposed to be the knowledgeable one. So if you're a Roman or a Greek, this is where you're getting the news of who are the Jews, from this. Moses, wishing to secure for the future his authority over the nation, gave them a novel form of worship opposed to all that was practiced by other men. Things sacred with us, meaning we pagans, with them have no sanctity, while they allow what with us is forbidden. That's true. That's true. Jews are okay with things the Romans would be shocked at, and vice versa. Okay, that's true. In their holy place, they have consecrated an image of an animal by whose guidance they found deliverance from their long and thirsty wanderings. That's a rumor that they used to say, the Samaritans put it out, that in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, it's not an empty room in Bais Sheni, but there's a statue of a golden ass with a boy sitting on it. The whole thing is solid gold. And why? Because everybody knows the story that the donkeys, right, help them find the water. You see? Now they slay the ram, that's the Karm Pesach, seeming derision of Hammon. That's true, by the way. It's making fun of the Egyptian god. And they sacrifice the ox because the Egyptians worship it as Apis. They abstain from swine's flesh in consideration of what they suffered when they were infected by the leprosy to which this animal is liable. So that's how the Romans say, why don't the Jews eat pork? Right? Unless we all know pigs are dirty. Dirty brings disease. And Jews are always full of disease, and therefore they want to remember it. By their frequent fasts, they still bear witness to their hunger of former days. And because the Roman can't understand, why would you fast all day long on something? And the Jewish bread, meaning matzah, made without leaven, is retained as a, I have to move this chair, as retained as a memorial of their hurried seizure of corn, or meaning of grain. We're told that the rest of the seventh day was adopted because this day brought them a termination of their toils. After a while, the charms of indolence beguiled them into giving up the seventh year too. So in other words, you got 1 day off, and finally they said, we should do a year of this, just not working, because we all know these don't like to work. The worship, however introduced, is upheld by its antiquity. All the other practices, at once perverse and disgusting, owe their strength to their very badness. The most degraded of the other races, scorning their national beliefs, brought to them contributions and presents, which augmented the wealth of the Jews. So he, as a Roman senator, is really angry that all these Romans are converting to Judaism and giving their money away to Beis HaMikdash, or the local synagogue. You understand? The depraved of the races, meaning all the pagans who are switching to Judaism, which there were those, are just terrible and perverse. As well as the fact that among themselves they're inflexibly honest and ever ready to show the compassion. They regard the rest of mankind with the hatred of enemies. They sit apart at meals, they sleep apart, and though a nation singularly prone to lust, they abstain from intercourse with foreign women. Among themselves nothing is unlawful. Circumcision was adopted as a mark of difference from other men. Those who come over to their religion adopt the practice and have this lesson instilled to them to despise the gods, disown their country, and set at naught their parents, children, and brethren. I can hear that. Meaning, if I was a Roman and my kid converted to Judaism, you feel the same way a Jew if your kid converted to another religion. I hear that. Still, they provide for an increase in the numbers. It's a crime to kill any newborn infant. They hold the souls that perish in battle. The rest is not important. My point is like this. We have a lot of writers from the Greco-Roman period about the Jews. But you got to take it with 3 or 4 grains of salt, because they hear a mishmash, right? Like I say again, the Jews, there was something with the donkeys, and the Jews were in the desert, and the Jews, to look for water, and there was a guy named Moses, and this and that and the other, but by the time you put it together in Shalom, you can't recognize anymore. We see this right now all the time on the internet. Look how they spin the story of Israel and the Middle East, right? And again, there's always some piece of it that's correct, but they smish it with all kind of other things. That's the problem. Okay, in the 300s BCE, Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. This used to be the old Persian Empire. Look how big it was. This is what Iran is still dreaming for now. What they call the Axis of Resistance. They set up an operation in Hezbollah. They have the Houthis. This is how they operate. You don't understand. To the Iranians, they memorize this map and they say, we're going back to it one day. You see, that's their project. But the public doesn't know. Now, that means after Alexander the Great, things changed. And you have the Hellenistic era, okay, which that same territory for the most part now became Greek kingdoms, as we'd say today, Hellenistic, Macedonian kingdoms. And there were Jewish communities that lived all over the place there. And that's my point. The Greek culture that penetrated everywhere in a way that was not true of the early imperial cultures happens now. So in other words, let's say when the Persians or the Babylonians ruled the territory, the Babylonians have their culture, and the local territory had its. Edom, Ammon, Moab, these places, they didn't switch to being Babylonians or Assyrians or Egyptians before then. But when the Greeks took over, all the cultures faded away and everybody picked up the Greek culture. That's the unusual nature of the Hellenistic conquest. It will happen again, one time with who? Arabs. The Arabs take over a gigantic empire. The Egyptians weren't Arabs, but they are now. The Babylonians weren't Arabs, but they are now. The Moroccans were not Arabs. They existed long before that. You see? So this kind of cultural imperialism is interesting. Not for the last time, the tide of Hellenism had 2 effects on the conquered peoples and races. It had a religious effect and a cultural and linguistic effect. The religious effect was the Greek gods spread everywhere. And if you remember, the Taliban, when they took over in the 90s or 80s, whatever, they blew up Greek temples in Afghanistan. They said to Buddha, what the heck is a Greek temple doing in Afghanistan? That's left over from Alexander the Great in that time, from the Hellenistic empires. All over the Middle East, things look different. People didn't talk like Arabs. They didn't dress like Arabs. They tried their best to imitate the Greeks, the Hellenistic cultures, okay? After all, it's not so hard to be pagan and polytheistic and switch your gods, okay? After all, you can have the old gods being displaced, or the old gods can be absorbed in a syncretistic manner, like Serapis in Egypt. The Greeks, when they conquered Egypt, they could not understand how can intelligent people, and the Egyptians are intelligent, how can you worship behemoths? Doesn't make any sense. If you tell me the gods are like in the human form, all right, the human is the most advanced creature, right? Okay, I get it. So maybe Hercules looks human. You're not going to say Hercules looks like a cow. I can kill a cow anytime I want. You're not going to tell me a pussy ant is a god. I can step on it anytime I want. How can somebody believe in that? You see? But on the other hand, the Egyptians did believe in that. And so it was old Samishkite until they evolved a syncretism in which the gods have the body of a man and the head of an animal. It's called Serapis. So this is how the Greek culture penetrated either fully or partially all over the place. Dionysus is always popular, correct? That's parties and orgies and things like that. That wasn't hard to spread over the Middle East. The Jews, and by the way, that's what the Greeks did in Hanukkah time. If you read the second book of Maccabees, they put in the Dionysus in the base of English. Now, the Jews are the only ones that said no. In this whole empire, the Babylonians and the Syrians, and the peoples in Asia Minor, and the Egyptians, for crying out loud, and the Persians, believe it or not, and Afghanistan, and Bactria, and Sogdia, and Pakistan, and blah, blah, blah. Everybody switched over to the Greek religions. The Jews were the only exception. They're the only ones that said no, which makes sense to the Greeks, because the Jews are the only monotheists. In other words, there's all kinds of religions out there. One of them, a weird one, doesn't believe in any other gods. Ha, ha, ha. Okay? The Jews were, at the time the Greeks met them, the only ones who prohibited idols and images. And these were ancient customs, they have antiquity. And to the Greek mind, or the Roman mind, if something's been around for a long time, it's not weird, it just has antiquity. We do that today. You look at some practices of different religions, transubstantiation, eating the body and the blood of Jesus in the thing. It's been around for a long time. It's a well-known religious practice, you see? If you go to India, remember, it's a long-time practice. You burn the widow with the husband. Remember, sati. Yeah, it's been. No, you can't say there's some new Mishigas. It's old Mishigas, man. What do you call old Mishigas that's old? Religion. You understand? That's what it is. And so, damn it. No, so the Greek can say like this. Who came up with circumcision? Who came up with Shabbos? Oh, the Jews have been doing it for thousands of years. All right. You see? For this reason, the Greek or the Macedonian rulers accommodate their Jewish subjects during this period. So in the area of religion, Jews everywhere, this is just interesting, in the Seleucid Empire, in the Ptolemaic Empire, and all the different Greek areas, how should I put it? Everybody has to go to the religious festival except the Jews. Everybody has to attend the games, which are religious, except the Jews. Everybody has to do this and this and this, and eat this except the Jews. They put in that clause, because the Jews are weirdos and they have their separate clause. And it's not like they're doing something to diss us. They've been doing this for a long time. You understand? Now, you can be sure, wherever there was a Jewish community, they paid good money to get that. You understand? That's how the world works. But the Jews were willing to do that. They're willing to do that. And they get off. And by the way, it caused a lot of anti-Semitism, didn't it? Everybody's got to do this except the Jews. How'd you like that? And especially if the Jewish neighbor is not stupid, so you don't look out the window when everybody has to go to a pagan church at 6 o'clock in the morning. But and I know most Jews are stupid, so they look out the window and go ha ha ha, immediately you make anti-Semitism. Anyhow, moreover, the Jews during this period are not shy about sticking up for their own beliefs. I would even say every Jew was a missionary, meaning they argued and had discussions with pagan friends and Hellenistic people all the time. There are a lot of records of this. I'm talking from non-Jewish sources. And so, let me put it this way. There's a good argument for an invisible God. There's a good argument for a philosophical conception of the deity, and not a Serapis or something like that. Jewish ideas do penetrate the non-Jews to an extent, okay? Meaning that a lot of the Jewish notions, I'm talking about what you see in Roman and Greek writers, made sense to the people around who were not Jewish. It made sense to them. Now, at the same time, the cogency of Judaic notion is in constant tension with anti-Semitism, because, let me put it this way, there's Judaism and then the Jews. So Judaism is admirable. The Jews aren't. The obnoxiousness was there, and therefore there's always this tension. So what do you think of the Jewish institution of Sabbath? It's actually a very interesting idea. Do you ever want to become Jewish? God, no. Right? Why? Too many damn Jews there, right? That's why I wouldn't go into the synagogue. Now, that's how they talk. So, hold that thought. We'll return to it. Culturally, it's a different matter. That was the area of religion. But there was also the Greek culture, Hellenistic culture. That's a different matter. The Jews do create a diaspora throughout the Hellenistic world. There were small communities everywhere. Meaning, if you look at that map, and you imagine there were dots there, could somebody give me a Kleenex? Sorry. Okay. I didn't do sufficient planning. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. In terms of Greek culture, not religion, the Jews have a diaspora. They're scattered all over the place in communities. And what do we know about the Jews in these communities in Alexandria, in Athens, in Sparta, in Damascus, and so forth and so on? Shinu Lashonim, Shinu Mabushim, Shinu Shemam. Right? The Jews adopted Greek names. We have plenty of names of Jews from the old days. They're always Greek names. Now maybe they had one for Shul, And they dress Greek, because you look at pictures in the archaeology of anything Jewish. They're all dressed Greek. And the language that they're usually writing is Greek. As a matter of fact, as we shall see, the synagogue service and the Kriyas HaTorah was all in Greek. Right? Even in Judea, which is the headquarters of the Jews in Yerushalayim, who was the Gadol Hador, the head of the rabbis, as we say today, after Shimon HaTzadik, according to the Pirkei Avos? Antigonus Ish Sochod. Say that name again? Antigonus? Here's a nice Jewish name, right? Now, you don't find that today. I can't imagine Antigonus Feinstein. I can't imagine Antigonus Schneerson. You understand? You see how pervasive the culture was. You see how heavy the assimilation was in selected areas among the Jews. This is the ultra-Orthodox I'm talking about. Antigonus Ishachab, Kiba Mishim HaTzadik. He was the head of Panovich, as we say today. But he's obviously Hellenized to a degree. Who are the leaders of the Jews? What Jewish names did we hear about in the books? John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, Philo, the Temple of Onias, Sumchus or Symmachus. These are not Jewish names. How come I look in the Bayis Sheni period? I don't see anybody named Avram, right? What are the what happened to Shlomo? What happened to all that? Okay, Alexander. The whole story of Alexander the Great, that Alexander became a Jewish name because he bows down to Shimon HaTzadik, as is that the next, do I have the picture? No. You all know that story, right? The famous story in the Talmud and Josephus, Alexander meets the high priest Shimon HaTzadik, and he bows down to him, and he says, I see this guy before the battles, and he's good luck to me, and all the rest of it. And the Jews say, since you treat us well, we'll name all the babies Alexander. How many people here are themselves or have relatives named Sender? Yeah, right? And old Jewish name, right? So, and in the Gemara, you have all the rest of it. You see? What is that? What is that? Okay? Now, the whole story of Shimon HaTzadik is just as a study in a certain type of assimilation. So the Jews Hellenized, but they did so selectively, not in terms of religion. Or let me put it this way, not consciously in terms of religion. Intellectually, were the rabbis hermetically sealed? Probably not. What about the Balabatim? Definitely no. Two examples come to mind. What do you have in Pirkei Avos? Antigonus Ish Socho. Antigonus, that's that name. What does he say in Pirkei Avos? Don't be like the servants who serve their master reward. Don't be like servants who serve their master not for the sake of reward. What is that? That's philosophy. Right? What does the Torah say? Do the mitzvahs or else. You want rain? Right? You want fertility? You get it? And here you're introducing the idea, no, I want to do this even if there was no schar. That's because Greeks came to him and said, what are you Jews doing this all for? Well, you're doing just for reward? So what do you have, like a transactional business with a tough boss? It didn't sound right. And even, people come to the rabbi, what's going on over here? No, 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 no. That's just for people who have no sensitivity. But you should be like those shalom nasa kabbalas. You do because it's the right thing to do. How come this never appears in the Bible? How come it only appears in the Hellenistic era? This shows you Greek challenges, intellectual challenges of a high level. Because by the way, that issue I just said is a high level question. Why are you doing mitzvahs? Are you doing it strictly just to get reward? You're always registering your heavenly bank account? As that goes, your religion is not very admirable. Okay? But if on the other hand you say, it has nothing to do with reward, we tell people to do it for reward, and there is a reward. The person's like it, but there is a reward, right? But really you should do, let me put it this way, to use modern language, is the reason you don't walk around in Baltimore, Maryland and shoot people in the street is because you're afraid of getting in trouble with the law? I hope that's not the reason. A civilized person doesn't want to shoot somebody, right? By the way, I hear the other way also. Halavai, that everybody did it because of fear of the law. Baltimore would be a better place. We don't have that either. But you understand what I'm saying? You want to be beyond that. That's already a Hellenistic idea. Here's another one. Okay? Let's go to the next one. This is in the Mishnah. I've heard that the Jews say their God is a fire that consumes all enemies. Why is this fire, a pagan asked the rabbi, is aimed against the idol worshippers? Wouldn't it be better for your God to destroy the idols itself? In Rome, Rabbi Gamliel is asked, according to Mishnah, a question. Why doesn't God destroy the idols if they're so bad? Like I would say today, why doesn't God just kill all the anti-Semites? Make the world a better place. Or why don't you, why doesn't God get rid of cancer? You understand? Why doesn't he get rid of the idols? And he said in Mashal, a certain king had a son whom he gave a little dog as a present for a birthday. The son loved the little dog, fed him, washed it, raised it, he grew so much to love it. One day he announced to the court, I'm going to name my dog Father. You're going to name the dog Father. Now, said Rabbi Gamliel, at whom should the king be angry? Should he be angry at the little dog who's doing nothing more than being a poor dumb animal that knows nothing, is not responsible for the whole affair? Or should he pour his wrath out at the son who initiated the entire affair? Get it? No, what are you blaming the moon for? The moon didn't do anything. These idiots are worshiping the moon, or the sun, or whatever. You get it? Even an idol. Don't take it out on the poor piece of wood. Some jerk decided to turn it into a statue and worship it. It's not the wood's fault. That's his answer, right? Another question. Philosopher said, I hear what you say, your words are wise. Nevertheless, the fact the idols are here is an obstacle in the path of worship. If the idols were destroyed, the people would not be able to worship them. That's a good argument also. What are you seeing over here? This is not Judaic. This is Hellenistic. Why? Give me the reason behind it. Defend your position. Explain yourselves. That's a new challenge. You understand? Now, by the way, ask some real from me. I don't know. I don't care. That's a Gaisha question. I don't know. I'm not interested in that. You see? But Rabbi Gamliel wasn't like that, was he? So, they were aware of the intellectual Hellenistic challenges to Judaism, but the Jewish thinkers developed counter-arguments. The rabbinic thought, what does the Talmud say? Avraham Avinu learned Torah. What Torah did Avraham Avinu learn? Masechtas Avodah Zarah. What is Masechtas Avodah Zarah? All the other religions. That's a Hellenistic notion. In other words, Abraham must have been faced like we are today, with this question and that question and arguments in favor of it, and he must have known the answers. You see? Nobody brought that up beforehand. The Pesach Seder is an excellent example, and I've spoken about many times, of responding to a different type of challenge. It's a classic example of reconstitution. You saw in Tacitus that the Egyptians put out a counter-narrative. What happened was the Bible was translated into Greek, which itself is a hallmark of assimilation, but the Bible was translated into Greek. All of a sudden, the people who weren't Jewish are able to read the Bible, which they couldn't do beforehand, in Greek translation. Let's say you're Egyptian, and you read this book called the Bible. It was translated in Egypt. Egypt doesn't come out looking too well from the Passover story, right? I mean, by the time it's over, Pyro in pajamas in the middle of the night, Pyro said, I'm not listening to God all the rest of it. By the time it's over, he's on his hands and knees. So naturally, the Egyptians say it's a lie, and they present a counter-narrative, traces of which you see in the Tacitus account. And what happens? You were kicked out because you were a public health menace. You didn't enforce your way out of here. We threw you out because you're no darn good, et cetera. And the mob says you stole the bread on the way out because you're a bunch of thieves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let me tell you something. Tucker Carlson, what do most people believe? As I always point out with great sadness, what do most people, according to most people in the world today, who did 9/11? Right? And according to most people in the world today, who is Jeffrey Epstein working for? You see? So the Egyptians put their narrative out there. And I'm sure Jewish kids, like today, some started believing it. And the Jews are freaking out. And they develop, we don't know exactly how, you have a pretty good idea. In Egypt, you take a Greek institution called a symposium, which is a formal meal with 4 questions and 4 cups. And each one of the 4 cups you discuss an intellectual topic. You don't have to, but that's usually what a symposium is. And they reconstituted it in Egypt as a Pesach Seder, meaning a retelling of the story of the Exodus from our point of view, our narrative. Let's get one thing straight, buddy. And for your narrative, you can take it and whatever. You understand? Now, what is that? It's a Greek institution. 4 cups, 4 questions, right? I could go in the Greek. Afikoma. Epikomium really means, that's when you bring out the belly dances at the end. But the Jews reconverted into something different, okay? And the epikomium. My point is like this. You take something that's Goyish, you reconstitute it something Jewish, and then it becomes a bulwark of the Jewish defense against the challenge of the outside culture. The great irony, of course, is what eventually happens to Egypt and the rest of the Middle East. They go Christian later. If you go Christian, and Egypt became a heavily Christian country, 10% of the population is still Coptic today. So if you're Egyptian and you're a Christian, damn it, you have to accept the Old Testament also, right? And damn it, you have to accept the Moses story. Right? Now you can Christianize it. You can say the blood of the Lamb is Jesus and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, the Egyptians were the bad guys and the Jews were the good guys. So the story I just told you from Tacitus is unknown to most people. It's kind of funny. But what are we talking about? A classic example of responding to assimilation and its challenges through selective appropriation and reconstitution. Perhaps the most interesting example of assimilation and constitution is tefillah. The Rambam says, as I told you before, tefillah was invented by the Assimilation in the Persian Empire, specifically as an Ivrit phenomenon. And I won't read it to you. You have the whole text up there. But the Rambam says that, as I told you before, when the Jews came back in Bayis Sheni, they had problems and nobody was davening anymore. Basically, according to the Rambam, and I've said this many times, there's no din of davening. You talk to God once a day and say whatever you want. That's pretty much what it is, right? And he says he had a little bit of praise in there. So let me put it this way. Lord, you're looking good today. I like that tie. Powerball lottery. David Katz. Here's my number, all right? I really want, well, listen, it's not rote prayer. I want it. For the second or two that I'm davening, I have total kavanah. Let that girl say yes. Let that boy say yes. For that young person, whoever it is, total kavanah. And that's all. And that's what you're supposed to do. It morphed into what you and I know formal rote prayer. Starting with the Amidah, with the Shemoneh Esrei and all the rest of it. So the Rambam suggests it happened in the Persian Empire for various reasons, because the people are inarticulate, and this would give you a template to be articulate. Perhaps so, but that's not what evolved in the Hellenistic world. Instead, evolved Hellenistic Judaism. Herein lies the tale. I told you before, most Jews, or a lot of Jews, live in the Chutz La'aretz. If you see all those dots on the map, those are Jewish communities, and there are more than that. How do you remain Jewish? Living in Italy, or in Greece, or one of these other places, as a tiny group. They evolved a synagogue. The institution of synagogue is a Greek word. This is a Greek-speaking institution filled with genuine Judaic content. It's a classic example of the complexities of assimilation and why superficial analyses fall short. Because it's a shul, but in those days they all talk Greek. Tefillah eventually becomes at irregular intervals, like on every Saturday. And they have frum prayers, but they're in the Greek language. The Kriyas HaTorah is in Greek, from a Sefer Torah written in Greek. Hear what I said? The Sefer Torahs are written in Greek. The Mishnah says you can do that. As best as I can figure out, the first generations read the Torah in Hebrew, but it was translated by a maturgaman, which means somebody translates in the Greek. Imagine if we had this today, but now you have the art scroll, so you don't need it. As time and generations passed, and younger Jews assimilated more, the Torah came to be read in Greek, and the maturgaman became Rabbi Frand. Instead of simply translating the words, you talk about the parsha, right? And if you're good, you even attract non-Jews to the service, if you're a good speaker. And a lot of non-Jews have always pointed out, this is the origin of the sermon, but the sermon has to be Judaic, but in a Hellenistic key. Because you can be sure, if you're interpreting the parsha, you're not giving a Hasidic vort, and you're not giving a Litvish vort, you're giving a vort that applies, makes sense to the audience, some of whom are not Jewish, so you're going to explain the parsha of the week in a Hellenistic key. It's Jewish, in a Hellenistic type of way, okay? I'll bet, I wasn't there, I'll bet that the sermons de-emphasize the particularistic and do overemphasize the universal, right? So you can talk about Pesach as saying it's only for Jews and all the rest of it, or you can say Pesach is a universal holiday of human freedom because all people deserve to be free. And people say like this, I like that, okay? I like that. You want Judaism without Jews? Well, that's Christianity, which pops up during this period also. The most consequential result of this assimilation, because in the 300s, the 200s, and the 100s, more and more Gentiles popping up in shuls. More and more people who are not Jewish convert to Judaism, or at least join the Jews in some sense. I don't know how many of them actually circumcised and went all the way, but people show up in shul, and they're davening, and they're at the Seder, Passover Seder, and the other ceremonies, and they say, we like this stuff. That doesn't mean I'm giving up eating pork on Sunday. That doesn't mean I'm not going to church on Sunday, but I like the Saturday stuff. As time goes by, non-Jews are the majority in the synagogues outside of Israel and diaspora. That's how popular the Jewish services were, which is reflected in what you say in davening on Saturday morning, which represents an Israeli Haredi reaction against that, because what are all these goyim here in shul on Shabbos morning? You shouldn't even be here on Shabbos. These institutions like Shabbos were not given to others. Right? How does it say over here? We shouldn't have uncircumcised people in Shabbos. Meaning, you guys who say you're Jewish, but you won't go all the way. You have no business being here. It's only very racist. Very racist. But what does that show you? They're reacting to a phenomenon. And what is the phenomenon? You have a ton of people over here. Could this mean, maybe this is why you start to have people like say that a guy who keeps Shabbos is Chayav Misa? That's pretty heavy. It's in the Talmud, but what's the origins of that? Okay? I mean, does it go all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu? Maybe it does. I don't know. It's possible. It's also possible it's a lesson that starts to be advocated in the Second Temple. Maybe this is when they tighten up the conversion rules. When somebody's not Jewish, has to be initially discouraged. That would be one rabbinic reaction to Hellenistic assimilation. So Hellenistic Jews, I'm not talking about the Hellenists of the Hanukkah story. I'm talking about the regular Jew who lived in Chutz La'aretz. They talk Greek. They dress Greek. They study the Torah in Greek. And yes, the translation of the Bible in Greek itself is a hallmark of assimilation, a landmark in Hellenization. Or is it? There are two schools of thought. In the Talmud, they say it was a negative phenomenon. And there's a fast day around the Sar B'Teves, On the other hand, you have the famous letter of Aristeas, one of the old books, in which the Jews are proud of the fact that the Bible is now translated into Greek. So which is it? Which is the Jewish point of view? There are two Jewish point of view. I can't believe it. Okay? It's the old Art Scroll dilemma. Is the Art Scroll good or not? This way and that way. Was the Septuagint good or bad? I mentioned the challenge of intellectual assimilation. What about theological assimilation? Greek ideas penetrating the Jewish theology. In some places, who is Philo of Alexandria? A very famous philosopher just before the Beis Hamikdash. He is from, but in a Hellenistic key. You look at his explanation of mitzvahs, and they don't make any sense to us today. But they were NCSY of the year 50 BCE. They really were. Because he's trying to persuade the Jewish kids in Alexandria that they should keep Shabbos and keep kosher and all the rest of it. And maybe kashrus has to do with some kind of health thing or whatever, or your animal soul, or who cares? As long as they buy and sell on market, Other Jewish writers are like that. It's not so simple. As it happened, as far as I can tell, there was a Rav. But these would be the Gentiles who do not actually convert. They hang around the hedges. They have opinions, including theological opinions. Some of them go to church on Sunday in addition to the synagogue on Saturday, and they circulate their opinions. And so there's a lot of stories in the Torah that don't make any sense and could be challenged from a Hellenistic point of view. And what if the guy in the back isn't just some nice, demure person who says, I'm learning so much from this experience. But they're saying, Moses is wrong. Abraham is wrong, and blah, 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 blah. And these guys stand up and make a whole scene over there. And there were those who convert, but don't change their mental essence. They carry their non-Jewish ideas into their Jewish thinking. And so this is a happy hunting ground for syncretism, a mixture of Jewish ideas together with outside ideas. That's Christianity. That's how it pops up. That's how it happens. Okay? The Hellenistic era sees not idolatry, but all kind of sects. I'll just finish now by saying the most historically significant sect is the ones connected to somebody named Jesus. One of these sects will emerge later with the faith of Christianity. In its earlier years, Christianity will be a theological battleground between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Or this is the impact of Hellenistic assimilation upon the Jews. And what do you do about that? But the hour is late, so let's do that for another time. Good night.